Thank you, Dan, and it's wonderful to be here. And what a stimulating day we're having, and it's just such a wonderful group of eminent academics and medics and people from all different areas, and just talking about all the things that we've been going through over the last 18 months, and just how it's turned our world upside down, hasn't it? It's turned our world upside down. We've gone from the freedom that we were used to, that Frank was talking about in January, February last year. And I don't know about you, but I sometimes get almost a little bit emotional when I think back to what life was like in January and February, and see memories from there. And my brother got married in February 2020, and that was the last big gathering I went to. And just reflecting on how our lives have been turned upside down since then by this health crisis that has turned into a cultural crisis. And so we're looking now, we've been looking at the data and whether lockdowns work this morning, and this afternoon we're going to be looking at the social, and in this session we're going to be looking at the social, political and legal aspects to what's been going on in this last year and a half or so. So we're going to start by asking a question of Francis, who, as Dan said, is a barrister very much involved with legal cases around constitutional issues around the lockdowns. And Francis, Jonathan Sumption, the former Supreme Court judge, has famously said that the government, in his opinion, has acted beyond its lawful powers, beyond its authority in bringing in many of the measures that have been brought in since February and March last year. And he has said that people would be within their rights. He says they would be within their rights to disobey, to not obey these bad laws. Now, what do you think about in what ways do you think that the government has acted beyond its lawful powers and trampled on the rights of citizens in the last 16 months or so?
Thanks, Will. That was very much the subject of the article I wrote and the challenge that we did. I want to do a slight segue first, because it seems to me this is important to answering this question too. And it seemed to me, reflecting upon this event, which is exactly as Will said, is composed of people from disciplines across the spectrum. The contrast with the Citizens' Assembly that happened last week, which had the mono-focus on COVID, and I think in that case zero COVID, we can say, is instructive. Because I think that there have been two conflicting things about this crisis, and it is far more a crisis of politics and culture than it is a crisis of health. One is the lack of humility of the governing classes and the government in particular, by which I really mean the civil servants who are running the country. And let us be in no doubt, and this is one part of the answer to the question, that we are not governed by democratic politicians. They have put public health officials in charge, and that in itself is a democratic crisis of extraordinary ramifications. They have a lack of humility, but there is also too much humility by everyone else. And again, that goes back to the monomania that we have seen over the last 16 months, because people say, you are not an epidemiologist. And of course, you are not an epidemiologist, so you do not have the very specific, specialized field of epidemiology. But we need to approach this in a multifaceted, multidisciplinary way. That didn't quite answer the question, I apologize, but I think it is important because it goes directly to the way in which our courts dealt with this. We had two principal challenges. The first was the one that Jonathan Sumption championed, which was that the Public Health Act was never designed to allow the government the kind of extraordinary powers that it took upon itself to implement by secondary legislation, but without prior parliamentary approval in March. We have a particular act of Parliament, the Civil Contingencies Act, which gives the government very restricted powers, but very wide powers. And the restriction is that they need approval by Parliament, both houses of Parliament, within 7 days. And that's 7 actual days, whether Parliament is sitting or not. Whereas the Public Health Act that was used allows ministers to legislate, make law, delegated by the Public Health Act, and that comes into force whether or not, if it's used, they use the emergency procedure, whether or not either House of Parliament has debated it, potentially indefinitely, because the period within which it needs to be approved is only the period within which Parliament is sitting, and of course Parliament wasn't sitting in March and April. There was no suggestion, obviously, ever before March 2020 that could be used to impose wholesale bans on who entered one's own house, how many people one can see, rather than targeted measures on gatherings, specific gatherings. The specific reference to gatherings in the Act, and it's very obviously, in my view, not unfortunately the Court of Appeals, that does not apply to every single meeting between more than one person. It is a bastardization of that phrase. And in fact, there's previous findings of the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court that make it very clear that you must look at the way in which the Act of Parliament gives the power, and you can't go and say, well, we say this means this, because that's not how it works. It's back to front. The second challenge that we did, we were unsuccessful on that, but with reasoning that frankly was very poor.
Francis, can I ask, from the way you're explaining it, it sounds like it's an open and shut case in terms of and from what Jonathan Sumption has said as well, it seems like an open and shut case that the government has exceeded its authority. And yet, as you've just mentioned, the Court of Appeal and the courts seem to more often than not, even almost all the time, find in favour of the government and against what seem to be the correct legal arguments. Do you want to say something about that and how the courts have handled this?
I will, but I think, without going into the detail of how that point was argued, I think I want to just address, because I think it can deal with it in a more general way, the way in which they dealt with the second part of the challenge, which is even if the Public Health Act gives this power, Parliament, or rather the secondary legislation, the government imposing regulations like this, they have to be proportionate, and they have to be proportionate restrictions on individual rights. And looking at what Professor Faridi was just saying, the relationship between the state and communities, individual communities, free communities, and which doesn't mean the state, and the individual has been changed fundamentally over the last 16 months. And one of the ways in which it's changed is that the Court of Appeal seemingly didn't recognize that yes, of course, it is right that you can balance fundamental rights where you have specific targeted interventions. So you might want to ban a festival because there might be a bad virus in a particular town. This is the kind of classic way in which the Public Health Act was envisaged. But it doesn't mean, and no suggestion has ever been made before, that these measures can impose upon the whole society, irrespective of whether they are healthy or unhealthy. That is a revolutionary way of changing governance and changing the way in which we imagine the relationship between the individual and the state. There's no precedent for it. It's obviously, as Nick Hudson was saying at the beginning, contrary to all pandemic planning. It comes from an idea that was imposed in China, which the closest parallel in the West is the Middle Ages. But even in the Middle Ages, when we had the plague, which really was the plague, 40% IFR at times, we didn't quarantine the healthy even then. We quarantined with a black cross the unhealthy, those who had the plague. So even in the plague, we didn't do this. Even in the plague, and yet we're doing this now. And apparently, according to the Court of Appeal, that's just fine. And just one, sorry, I've gone for quite a long time, sorry about that. But the one case that the Court of Appeal mentioned was a case called Eastside Cheese, and it is a perfectly properly decided case about how you measure the discretion that government has when they are advised by scientists about specific measures. But the clue is in the title. This was about cheese regulation. There were other cases relied on by the government about the regulation of mink farms and so on. So obviously you give the government a very high degree of appreciation when you're dealing with that. But what wasn't recognized was that this is about the whole of society, the way that the whole of society runs. And the idea that you can change that by secondary legislation imposed by ministerial fiat with no debate in Parliament, because we're not talking about the Coronavirus Act, which was an act. These were all regulations, were all put, including masks, all put under the Public Health Act. The idea that you can do that is an extremely disturbing one, and as I say, contrary to all precedent, and contrary, frankly, to the functioning of a free society. So we have a crisis. How do we get out of it? Well, we could pass a pandemic act of Parliament, but ultimately, the courts had the power to stop the government from doing this. So even though we don't have a written constitution in this country, because of the way that the government decided to act, the courts had the same kind of power that they could have had in the United States or in France to reverse that, and yet they didn't do it. So if we can't rely on the courts, we can't rely on the civil service, we can't rely on the media, we can't rely on academia, where do we go?
And it sounds like it's the courts have kicked it back to the politicians and basically said it's a political question. So maybe that's a great segue to talking to Lee about, to Dr. Lee Jones about the political aspects of this. And as we heard from Nick Hudson at the beginning, the government had a pandemic plan. It was developed about 2011 and was based on World Health Organization guidance and involved all kinds of recommendations, none of which included lockdowns. It did consider the possibility of the things that we've been doing in the last year and a half and concluded that they should not be done, recommended against them. And yet that was, as we know, thrown out the window in favor of this novel authoritarian intervention that seemed to originate in China, lockdowns. Lee, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you think that came about politically?
Yeah, of course, and I very much agree with what Francis says, that this is a crisis of politics, it's a crisis of the state, and in particular it's a crisis of democracy. And I also want to put across some ideas today which may be difficult for some people to wrap their heads around, because a lot of the critique of lockdown has come from libertarians, and particularly from the libertarian right. And that's largely because the political left has become lockdown left. And so I suppose I'm quite rare in critiquing lockdown from the left. And what I want to say about liberty in the state is that the pandemic has shown us that they are interdependent. They're not a trade-off. If you want liberty, and if you want any other public goods like health, then we need a well-ordered state. We don't need less state, we need a well-ordered state. And the problem that we had in this country is we don't have a well-ordered state. We have a state in an advanced state of decay. That's the argument that I want to put across. The very first question of today was, why was the pandemic rulebook torn up? I didn't feel we got an answer to that question. The answer isn't that we weren't expecting a pandemic or that this plan didn't exist. We've been preparing for a pandemic in this country since 1997. And that has been continuously informed by World Health Organization guidance. The last one, as Will just said, was the 2011 Pandemic Preparedness Strategy. And pandemic disease had also become a Tier 1 security threat in the National Security Strategy. It's also not quite the case that the strategy wasn't used. In the early months of the pandemic, this strategy was taken down, dusted off, and followed pretty much by the book. The Coronavirus Action Plan issued on the 3rd of March largely just operationalized that plan for the coronavirus pandemic. 20 days later, we were in lockdown. Now, the reasons for this are very complex, and lots of different disciplines will have their own viewpoint. But what I want to try to argue today is that it has a lot to do with the transformation in British politics and the state since the 1970s. And the shift from what I would call a command and control state, which we had in the decades after the Second World War, to a neoliberal regulatory state, which is what we've had since the 1980s. So the command and control state was where the institutions of wartime were repurposed for peacetime. We had very clear lines of accountability and control in the state, and the state owned key national resources. Political leaders had the will and capacity to mobilize public resources and the population itself for the public good, to solve social problems, to produce societal progress. And democratic engagement in this form of state was also very strong. Now, from the 1980s onwards, that state has been dismantled and replaced by a neoliberal regulatory state in which state resources and responsibilities have been privatized, decision-making has been transferred to unelected bodies, and the central government has retreated from direct intervention in society to try to address societal problems to what is called in the academic literature negative coordination, which means basically sitting back and writing reams of regulatory guidance and frameworks and strategies and so on, which others then develop into specific actions. All of these changes were explicitly designed to make the state less responsive to public demands and to avoid political accountability for social and economic outcomes. Constantly being telegraphed by the political elite to the public is the message that they should expect less of the state, continuously less. So how does that affect pandemic preparedness planning? If we look at the 2011 strategy, it reflects this regulatory state model. The government did not authoritatively mobilize resources necessary to fight a pandemic. It merely set out principles and guidelines for others to follow, other agencies that were supposed to develop their plans and their arrangements to actually contain and fight disease. But these agencies were under-resourced and didn't develop effective plans. The NHS received no specialized investment, but had to rely on existing surge planning, which means discharging patients to free up beds, the number of which has halved over the past 30 years. And we heard earlier on today that the number of ITU beds is well below comparable countries. And this is why over 25,000 elderly patients were discharged into care homes in March and April last year, seeding the disease into the most vulnerable part of the population. Some of the agencies mentioned in the 2011 strategy had their capacities hollowed out through austerity. Public health laboratories, for example, were cut. Responsibility for public health was devolved to local councils, and then their budgets were cut by £700 million. The Public Health England budget for infection control in 2020 was just £89 million. Some of the agencies mentioned in the 2011 strategy didn't develop any plans at all until 2016, when Exercise Cygnus wargamed these plans and found that they could not withstand even a serious pandemic. Some of the agencies didn't develop any plans at all. Some of the agencies no longer existed. So all of this explains why, for example, test and tracing was secretly abandoned on the 12th of March 2020 because the entire system could only handle 5 COVID tests per week. Other state functions had been outsourced to inept private companies. This included even the stockpile for personal protective equipment to be deployed during a pandemic. Even that had been privatized, outsourced to a French logistics company called Movianto. The value of its stockpile had fallen by 40% in the austerity years, and by January 2020, it had just 2 weeks of stock on hand, with 45% of its PPE having expired on the shelf. PPE procurement had also been outsourced by the NHS under the management consultancy Deloitte in 2011 to private middlemen who all failed to deliver as promised, thanks to their profit-maximizing, just-in-time delivery model, which of course relied on global supply chains which collapsed during the pandemic. And crucially, I think, the 2011 strategy was organized around delivering as little as possible to the public, which reflects the state's general retreat from providing from public needs. The strategy, which was informed by the best scientific opinion available, constantly footnoted, declared that it would be, quote, a waste of public health resources to try to contain a new pandemic disease, and so would pursue, quote, business as usual. It explicitly accepted between 210,000 and 315,000 additional deaths over a 15-week period, which translates to accepting between 2,000 and 3,000 excess deaths per day. This was not a plan for social engineering, as we heard this morning. This was a plan to do rather little. This strategy had been developed by technocrats, by scientific experts, and by civil servants, crucially, without any public debate, without any public involvement, and without any democratic scrutiny. So it's hardly surprising that this plan imploded on contact with public opinion, because quite rightly, the British public expect a bit more of their state than this. They expect a state that can protect them. And in a context of panic and fear, which was erupting in the early months of 2020, when, let's remember, the case fatality rate was being estimated at anything between 1% through to 15%. We now know that the figure is much lower than that, but those were the figures being bandied about. Of course, the public was terrified, and not least because we have been governed by and through fear for many years. As Frank Furedi was talking about, as somebody that was closely involved in the Brexit wars, we saw this through the Remain Project Fear, where we were told that we would suffer from super gonorrhea, that we would run out of drinking water, that we would run out of medicine, that there would be war in Europe. This wasn't new either. We were warned before that we would all die of AIDS, of BSE, of bird flu. We live in a culture that is saturated by fear, so it's not surprising that the British public were afraid and they demanded more of the state. But the state had not authoritatively mobilized resources to manage a pandemic, as other societies have done and have managed to do it more effectively. It had not discussed these plans with the public, nor had it ratified them democratically. And this hollowed-out state, with so little democratic backing, did not have the authority to resist rising public panic and demands for lockdown. And so the state panicked into lockdown. It has been making things up as it goes along ever since, which is why we have a highly disorganized, fragmented, and irrational response. And the state has further fueled public fear in order to terrorize the public into obeying. And we have been ruled since by a highly shambolic regime. This is not one guided by a clear plan. The plan collapsed. Since then, they've been making it up as they go along. Frankly, they don't know what they're doing. They have deferred constantly to a very narrowly focused technocracy of epidemiological experts focused only on the management of a single disease. And crucially, Parliament is delinquent. It's quite right, by the way, for the courts to bounce this back to Parliament. Parliament should be making these decisions, but it isn't. It's delinquent. It declared itself non-essential by suspending itself and MPs returned home. The task of representing the people in the governance of the country is essential, but they declared themselves and their work inessential, while cleaners and bus drivers and delivery people had to go out and work. And of course, the entire public discourse and the media discourse has been organized around this monomaniacal focus on a single disease ever since. It has become the be-all and end-all of public policy. So I completely agree with Francis. This is a crisis. It's a crisis in the authority of the state and also in its democratic basis.
Thank you, Lee. It sounds like you're not a great fan of the pandemic preparedness plan of 2011. I think some other people in the room might be a little more keen on it than and its recommendations than you are. I don't know if either of the other members of the panel want to come back at Lee on any of his points.
Yeah, I don't know if this is working. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I was a fan of the pandemic preparedness strategy and felt that if only the government had followed that, we'd be in much less of a pickle than we are now. But I thought Lee's analysis was very interesting and quite insightful. But I'd hesitate to attribute the government's rush to lockdown to a failure of the neoliberal regulatory state, because even states with which look very different to ours also rushed into lockdown. I remember there was quite an interesting paper published, I think last year, showing that almost every country in the Western world and beyond locked down within a 2-week window of each other in March of 2020. And it was as though heads of state were simply copying each other. And they weren't doing, as we know, any sort of cost-benefit analysis. They decided to abandon whatever plans they put in place for these eventualities and just decided to copy one another. It was a sort of like children in a playground seeing a sort of leader do something and then all just following the leader. And it felt more like that psychologically than rooted in kind of systemic structural state failure, though in some ways I rather like the fact that our state is so staggeringly incompetent, and you sort of worry that if they were just a little bit more competent, then the tyranny that they've tried to impose upon us would be more efficient and harder to avoid. Britain these days often reminds me of one of those fictional Middle European states in a Marx Brothers film, like Fredonia. It's almost as though we've become East Germany, but the Stasi have been replaced by the Keystone Cops. And I can't help feeling that it would be worse if the Keystone Cops weren't policing us, but actually the Stasi were. You were going to ask me a question, though.
I am, yes. So this seems like a good opportunity. So, so looking at the wider cultural aspects of this, it's been pretty obvious since last summer that the pandemic and the lockdowns have coincided pretty neatly with some other cultural changes. Most obvious was the mainstreaming of the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd last May in America. And what connections do you think there are, Toby, between so-called woke movements like that and lockdownism and the way that we've responded to lockdowns?
Yeah, well, I'm going to say good question because I asked you to ask me that question. I think we all asked it, I've been sort of puzzling away at this for the past 16 months. There does seem to be an extraordinary overlap between woke ideology and pro-lockdownism. The people advocating one are often advocating the other. The professional classes, the international meritocratic elite, seem to very quickly take on pro-lockdownism in the same way that they very quickly took on all the nostrums of wokery a few years earlier. So what is the connection? Why has Davos man proved so susceptible to these twin ideologies? Well, there are some sort of, I think, some obvious parallels. So they're both a form of virtue signaling. And I think we're all familiar with that, and we've all noticed that. But I think something slightly different is also going on, which is it's a form of status signaling. There's a very interesting sociology PhD student at Cambridge called Rob Henderson, American, was a Marine, now doing a PhD in sociology. And he's come up with this theory about what he calls luxury beliefs. And luxury beliefs are beliefs which members of the upper middle class professions take on in order to advertise their superior status. So often they're beliefs which seem to have a moral character, but which cost them absolutely nothing. And the example Rob gave in a piece he wrote about this, which I commissioned for Quillette a couple of years ago, was polyamory. So in the 1960s and 70s, the upper middle class elite embraced kind of sexual licentiousness, the permissive society, polyamory, even though actually they didn't change their own behavior. They got married and continued to lead largely bourgeois lives, but these beliefs then trickled down into the working class and just wreaked absolute chaos and havoc. And you can see with wokery something similar going on. So when, a tenured professor at an Ivy League college advocates for defunding the police, it's not going to cost him anything because he can rely on campus private security. His life isn't going to be in any way endangered if there's a lower police presence in his neighborhood because he lives in an affluent suburb. And you can see the same thing. The interesting thing about luxury beliefs, it's not just that they cost you nothing and sort of earn you moral brownie points for advocating, but the fact that they cost you nothing is what makes them attractive. So if you advocate a belief which costs you nothing because you are a member of the upper middle class elite, it's a way of signaling your membership of that high status group. And I think the same thing seems to be going on with lockdown advocacy. It's not just that all the people who are most enthusiastic, the real lockdown zealots, the people on independent sage and so forth, it's not just that lockdowns, having to spend time in their homes, in their gardens, doing Zoom meetings and so forth, it's not just that it costs them nothing compared to, the one-parent family living at the top of a council estate with 3 kids they're trying to homeschool with inadequate Wi-Fi and only one working computer. It's not just that it costs them nothing. The fact that it costs them nothing is what makes it attractive to advocate, because it's a way of telling people, this policy will cost me nothing because I'm a member of the elite who work from home anyway. And I've got great Wi-Fi. And I think there does seem to be a kind of overlap there. It's a way of signaling your membership of a high status group, whether it's wokery or lockdown. But I also think there's something more profound happening as well. Just 2 more minutes. I think that we're in the midst of another crisis, which incredibly, given the number of crises that have been mentioned by this panel already, hasn't been mentioned yet, which is, I think, a crisis of legitimacy amongst the meritocratic elite. I think the failure of the Iraq War, the global financial recession of 2007 and 8, combined to really undermine the authority of the meritocratic elite, whose claim to rule, after all, is based upon their superior knowledge, their expertise, their skill at negotiating these geopolitical, global financial problems. So they screwed up twice quite badly. And that, I think, helped to fuel the populist revolts of 2016, which saw us leaving the European Union and saw the election of Donald Trump in America. And we also saw ramifications of that populist revolt elsewhere in places like Brazil, Poland, Hungary, and so forth. And I think that the meritocratic elite they were sort of searching for something to kind of renew, to restore their legitimacy. And that's what made wokeism so attractive. It gave them a kind of renewed moral purpose. We should be in charge because only we care about these historic injustices and are in a position to rectify them and make the world whole again. They gave themselves a kind of almost clerical role to justify their continuing power and influence. And also think that they've leapt on the pandemic for the same reason. Suddenly, here was an opportunity to prove to the world the value of having experts in charge, of having policies informed by science and data and evidence. It was a way of trying to restore their authority in the eyes of a skeptical kind of demos. And you've seen that in the way they've gone absolutely all in on the vaccines too. Won't hear a word against the vaccines, completely neglect to discuss any of the adverse effects. The vaccine is a miracle cure produced by the very best of the meritocratic elite. They've saved us. They've saved us as we always knew they would. Let's leave them in charge. Forget about these populist revolts. Let's never have someone like Trump in charge again. So I think what we need to think about is, what if we're right? What if our point of view, that actually the lockdown policy is a colossal error, a historically unprecedented policy error, which is going to have calamitous consequences. What if we're right? And what if we eventually do persuade the public that we're right, which I do think we will? What if the vaccines don't prove to be as effective as their advocates would have us believe? What if even more adverse events gradually begin to be recorded and people begin to lose faith in the vaccines? There could be a populist revolt on the horizon. We may even be seeing a taste of this in France over the past 48 hours, 72 hours. There could be an absolutely revolutionary populist revolt on the horizon. So I think one thing we need to think about is, what if we win this argument? What if we are proved right in a few years' time and we persuade the public that we're right? We need to think about how to contain the rage that's going to follow from that. There'll be a terrible reckoning, a horrible bloodletting, if we don't think about how to give this burgeoning revolt some kind of political direction. In America, it looks like they might have it in the form of Ron DeSantis and Kristi Noem and other political leaders. We don't have any heavyweight political leaders of the movement here. And I think we need to find some and think about that. And I know Nick Hudson's been thinking about that. We need to develop a kind of platform. We need to try and contain the rage, lest it spill over into something quite ugly and unpleasant. Maybe that's impossible, because when Lee and I sit down and try and find out what it is, what common program we can agree on, there may not be very much, because there are a lot of different elements in this movement who are it's a coalition, it's a very broad coalition, but maybe, just maybe, we can find a common political platform and find some heavyweight political leaders, perhaps someone in the Conservative Party to succeed Boris, Charles Walker, who knows. Anyway, so that's my 10 cents. We need political leadership to avoid the disaster when we win.
Excellent. But in the meantime, the elites seem to be absolutely set on trying to make sure that no one in the public hears anything that we have to say. And there's a number of people in this room and watching at home will have experienced some pretty awful censorship and worse in the last year or so. I don't know if you want to say anything about that. One of the obvious connections between lockdowners and woke activists seems to be their fondness for censorship and their aversion to free speech. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yes,
Francis.
It goes back. I'm actually publishing a report on this on Tuesday that Lawrence Fox kindly commissioned. But it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, and that very disturbing comment. I think it was Nick Hudson, that these people are treating science as though it's a process rather than an institution. And it is all about, it's not just science, obviously, it's every area of public policy is better done with good, honest debate. And the very idea that you can be safe because you're protected by an elite in terms of what you can express is a sort of an idea that the Pope that imprisoned Galileo would have wholeheartedly supported, and Galileo would not have done. So it's a really extraordinary reversal in the way in which we as a society have developed, and in every way a very bad one.
Do you have any hope? We've got a minute left. Do we have hope?
Less than Toby, unfortunately. But we as Luke was saying, we just got to plug on. We've got to put everything we possibly can into this fight and never, ever give up.
Do you want to have the final word, Toby?
Just one note of optimism on the media front. As a member of the media for 35 years, I've been really depressed by just how feeble the response of the mainstream media has been, and just how willingly they've gone along with the kind of propaganda being pumped out by Downing Street. And as you say, it's becoming more and more difficult to express any kind of dissenting point of view within the mainstream media and on social media platforms too. But one source of hope, I think, is that one thing we've really seen emerge during the past 16 months is a kind of alternative ecology of alternative media platforms, website, video platforms. People watching this are part of that kind of new ecology. Lockdown skeptics is part of it. And we've seen the emergence of a new breed of citizen journalists, I think, kind of ordinary people who are data literate, scientifically literate, not part of the mainstream media or the scientific establishment, but who've just want to challenge the data and interrogate some of these policies that claim to be informed by science. And the emergence of these data and scientifically literate citizen journalists and the accompanying platforms, media platforms that they've found and created to give themselves a voice, I think that is a source of hope.
Brilliant. Well, let's finish there. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Toby.